I knew with allegations that were so serious, we had to take them seriously.
The story turned out to be very complicated in lots of ways, to do with consent and when consent was granted. And we wanted to be fair by every side at every stage of the story.
With stories like this, you constantly have to ask yourself, what is the public interest?
Several of the women said to us, we don't want him to be cancelled. We just want him to stop. We just want him to be held accountable for his behaviour in these situations with very young women.
Should we start from the start? How does the story all begin?
I was at home on Exmoor and I checked my DMs from my public Instagram account, which I look at once in a blue moon. And there was a message from a woman, a young woman, saying, I've got a question, can I have your email address? Sent to my email address, nothing happened. A week later, I got the long email making accusations against Neil Gaiman that led to the creation of this podcast.
So Rachel first mentioned the tip but not the name ages ago now, I think before Christmas. And I was obviously really curious until one evening in February this year, Rachel called me and said, can you join a Zoom call right now? We're talking about the story. And I said, of course. And I remember joining this call and suddenly meeting for the first time Scarlett and hearing Scarlett tell this very disturbing story about Neil Gaiman. I was completely blown away by Scarlett's allegations on that call because they were unlike anything I'd ever heard. And I also had a sense that what Scarlett was describing wasn't the behavior, if true, of a man who'd done it for the first time. So I knew with allegations that were so serious, we had to take them seriously.
The story turned out to be very complicated in lots of ways, to do with consent and when consent was granted. And we wanted to be fair by every side at every stage of the story, and I hope we have been. But there's just been one thing that Scarlett told me at first and then repeated, and has absolutely, it checks out for right from the time this event happened to today, was that within a few hours of meeting and starting her work with Neil Gaiman, he got into her bath naked, and she alleges he assaulted her in the bath. And however way you spin it and cut it, however many texts a woman might send afterwards, that still happened in that order. And he was over 60 and she was 23. And she was a nanny coming into their household and meeting him for the first time on the first day. That was such a significant thing to hear and such a significant episode that we knew we could go further with this story. And Paul managed to find a second victim within a few months, but it was a hard road, wasn't it, Paul?
It was a lot. And with stories like this, you constantly have to ask yourself, what is the public interest? In fact, I remember it's the first thing our editor asked, what is the public interest in this story? Yeah. And he made exactly that nanny point, that there is a really problematic power dynamic, not just that he's older, but that she was dependent on him for an income, for housing, really for all the stability she had in her life at that point. And that seemed on its face to be, at the minimum, an abuse of power. So we could have told it in that way. And we did, in the end, tell it at least partly in that way. But there are these other public interest tests you should always apply. And, the risk was we'd end up telling a story of what he might describe as a messy and difficult sexual relationship, and that he'd never done anything like that before, and it's a he said, she said situation. As Rachel mentioned, we heard from Scarlett an allegation that there were other women, and which is one we took seriously as well, and was also another big public interest test for us. If he's done this many, many times, then there are stronger reasons to do this story. You know, you might argue that he is a threat to young, vulnerable women, that he uses his image to lure them in to problematic sexual relationships, which is also an issue. And so we started exploring all those things. And it took a while to break through this real silence around him, and this real culture of secrecy and fear, actually. And so speaking up was really, really quite difficult for them. And it took up months of, turning over stones until we got a lead to a woman who told us that she met Neil Gaiman when she was 18 at a book signing, and they began a sexual relationship within 2 years. And her descriptions of that sexual relationship matched in really precise ways what Scarlett had told us, even though they were separated by 2 decades and many continents.
As far as we were concerned, one of the public interests was the fact that Neil Gaiman's persona and also his career placed him in continuous contact with young, admiring women. There was his social media activity, which was very intense. He connected with fans all the time. There were his book signings, his attendance at readings and conventions, again placing him with young fans, impressionable fans. And then, of course, the fact that he had a child, and this was where Scarlett comes in. So that meant that we felt there was a strong public interest in reporting the allegations, because several of the women said to us, we don't want him to be cancelled. We just want him to stop. We just want him to be held accountable for his behaviour in these situations with very young women.
So we published the first 4 episodes on the 3rd of July. And I think it was a shock, right? Because before this story, there was one lone negative news story about Neil Gaiman, about him breaking pandemic lockdown rules to fly from New Zealand to the UK. That was it. No other kind of negative coverage of him at all. And so suddenly on the 3rd of July, this 4-episode podcast is released, and the allegations it reports are serious, sexual assault and very rough and degrading acts that the women say they never really wanted. And so it was a double shock, really, because it broke that story, 1. 2, his public image up until that point was radically different from what these women described. So he presented for years as a feminist, a trans ally, very kind of progressive, a supporter of vulnerable minorities. And so it wasn't a story like so many others in this vein, where you have a man who's been rumored to treat women really poorly, and everyone knows it, everyone talks about it, and then it makes the news. This happened almost the way around. It kind of made the news, and then suddenly people started talking about it. He's of course got a huge fan base. I mean, millions and millions of people around the world. And it seemed that for a lot of them there was this dissonance happening, where they thought, it can't be, it can't be, he's a feminist, he's told us. And so there was this initial burst of coverage. I mean, really around the world, because he's got readers everywhere. But then it sort of went quiet a bit, and people were kind of at a bargaining stage, I suppose, saying either it can't be true, or maybe it is true, but it's not illegal. And so that was happening publicly. But then the strange and position that we were in as journalists is a lot of other women were contacting us.
Yeah.
We were kind of in this position where we were talking to more women and then seeing this kind of online discourse, which is, he's not that bad, it can't be true, they've exaggerated it, it's sensational. So then within a month we published another episode with Julianne and Caroline. And then there was another burst of coverage. And I think that there was real significance there that, this pattern, a clear pattern started emerging, that these allegations were starting to paint a very clear picture, not a murky one anymore. And in their cases, or in Caroline's case, there was a big exchange of money for an NDA, which was the second one, right? So he had signed on with Scarlett as well. And so we had a burst of coverage then, but still there wasn't any formal response. So the platforms didn't react by that point. His publishers neither, and the organizations he's kind of supported and worked with. And then we heard from a fifth woman who told us a similar story to the ones we had heard about sexual assault, and told us that when she confronted Neil Gaiman with her allegations many years after that alleged assault happened, he paid her $60,000 for her therapy costs, and also said he'd make a donation to a rape crisis center where she worked. And then she told us that when she had those phone calls with Neil Gaiman, the ones where she confronted him, she recorded them, thinking she would need to refer to them, if there's any follow-up with him. And we thought that was a moment in the reporting, because Neil Gaiman hasn't spoken publicly since the 3rd of July, right? He's been historically very vocal on social media and in the press. And so for the first time, people could hear Neil Gaiman talk in his own voice about one of these women's cases. And I think, it was the accumulation of evidence that she was the fifth woman to go to do a recorded interview. And we had those recordings of him speaking.
Yeah, and he was saying, acknowledging his behavior as well.
Yes.
So it was hard then for his fan base or his publishers or the streamers to dismiss out of hand the women's testimonies as partial or made up or she saids. We also had he said on it, and he said,
Yes.
My behavior was shittier than I remembered, and I'm sorry about this, and would it help if I paid you? I'm sorry this has taken up so much headspace.
It was a moment.
Yeah.
And it was, looking back now, the point at which these platforms started responding. So Netflix cancelled a show that was based on Neil Gaiman's work, Dead Boy Detectives, without saying why. And then Disney paused its plans to turn one of Neil Gaiman's books, The Graveyard Book, into a feature film. And then finally, Amazon said they're pausing production of a third season of Good Omens.
As far as I'm concerned, I think what's actually added depth and power to this series is the way that we have, as far as we've been able to legally, put Neil Gaiman's side of the story, which I don't know was intentional on the part of Neil Gaiman and his various teams of advisors and lawyers. But for me, and I think Paul too, you know, I come from a print background. It was like, this is gold, because what you want as a reporter is to get the other side of the story, and you very rarely get it. But Neil Gaiman gave us his side of the story.
This statistic that's often mentioned, but rarely ever properly thought about, that most sexual assault happens within a relationship. You know, marriage, a family relationship, an employer-employee relationship, whatever. It is by far and away the most common context for sexual misconduct. Yet, as a journalist, it is the hardest story to tell, because of exactly the kind of story Neil Gaiman presented, in that we were both willing and enthusiastic participants in this sexual relationship, and look at all our messages, look how many of these women sent me, look how full of affection they are. And I think we all started thinking more seriously about the idea that both these things can exist, because we know they do, that you can have the sexual misconduct and you can have what looks like a consensual relationship, and that there are specific acts and moments within a relationship that might not be consensual. But that, as journalists, becomes very hard to unpick, because you have to ask very difficult questions of everyone involved. You know, if he really did this to you, why did you go back? Why did you stay?
Why did you text him afterwards saying that was lovely?
Yes, and you know, those are all facts, and you have to report them and deal with them. And that meant also that the podcast contained a lot of material, you know, quite graphic descriptions of people's behavior and reporting of their communication. But that, it was obvious to us at a point in the reporting that was really the story, that you can have all those things and you can have the allegations of misconduct.